Hello, everyone. Settlers Lament here again with Charlemagne, Dr. Levi, Levi? I don't know. Renaissance Man and 21st Reaction. And we're back here again discussing Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, and in particular, we're discussing one of his. I don't know if this is his most famous speech or if this is like one of his most famous speeches, but it's a pretty famous speech from him that he gave at a Harvard commencement speech. And there's a lot of sort of interesting stuff that he talked about in here. So we're going to mostly be going over that today. This was sort of 21st reactions. This was his idea. So he's mostly going to be the one guiding this discussion. So no pressure. But first, I wanted to mention that I'm very disappointed in my friend Charlemagne here because he has submitted utterly to the Greeks on the Byzantine question.
I mean, like I said, it's normal for Italy to switch sides in the middle of a war. And I thought they made a pretty good case on the stream, Mr. Carl and his ally there. But I'm 75%. I'm open to being convinced the other way. And like I said, I need to actually. I'm interested now in doing some more reading on the subject. And Renman actually recommended just go read the primary sources. So I might look into that and see if I could come to some deeper determinations on this question because it is interesting.
I'd say the biggest problem with both sides on the debate was that they were treating it like it was a nation state and not as something different. So it was all kind of projecting modern concepts of nationhood backwards 2,000 years, which is kind of a big problem.
That is a good point. We glossed over the fact that these were empires and not nation states. I mean, I was kind of just there as a meme. AA invited me on like 2 minutes after the stream was supposed to start. And I kind of just sat there. And I just unironically did like a workout while listening to it. But I'm actually going to participate in this one. So.
Okay. But no, I mean, I think the strongest argument for why the Byzantine Empire was not the Roman Empire is because the keys were given to Peter and his successors, not to some Roman emperor, not to the Patriarch of Constantinople. Whatever you shall bind or loose, period. And the throne to the Roman Empire was given to you, to Charlemagne, not to the Greeks.
I mean, come on, we all know the Holy Roman Empire thing is kind of BS. I mean, in terms of continuing Rome.
I don't know. Like, I'm about to make the conversation really dark, but do you know the reason why the Holy Roman Empire was set up? Because
nothing too edgy, please.
Oh, okay. So basically, the Empress, I can't remember if it was Zoe or Irene, was really horrible and ruling with her lover. She even took her son, who was to be emperor of the Eastern Empire, and put out his eyes in the room that he was born in, so that he would be physically unable to take rule. Right, and so naturally, the Franks are getting a little bit freaked out by this whole thing, where there's this woman taking the eyes out of her own child in order to keep power with her lover. So they decide, well, we're going to set up something a little bit more legitimate sounding, and that's where the Holy Roman Empire came from.
Yeah, I'm gonna do a historical Charlemagne moment, and just take charge and see legitimacy, whether or not it follows the neat little narrative. Sees legitimacy. The topic is going to be Solzhenitsyn. Now, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was a very enigmatic man, a deep soul, you might say, someone with lots of things going on in his mind, and he had a life of quite serious suffering. He spent at least a decade in the prison camps in Eastern Russia. So that was a very difficult part of his life. So I just want to give context for the speech that he actually gave, because he gave the Harvard commencement speech in 1978. But before that, so he was in Russia. He was known as a political dissident, and that's partially why he was in the prison camps for about 10 years, from mid-1940s to 1950s. And then what happened is the final straw that broke the camel's back was him writing the Gulag Archipelago. And then he was forcefully arrested in 1974 and kicked out of the USSR. So he eventually flees over to a little small town, Cavendish, Vermont, and stays there for about 2 years for several years before giving the speech. So he's like coming from this outside perspective, suffered under the Eastern Soviet system, and just gets acclimated to the West for a couple of years. So it's kind of like a very clear outside perspective of just taking it all in. So it's quite amazing, because all the things that could have been said to the people running the Western system basically was said in this speech. And he doesn't tell it to the president. He tells it to the heart of the ruling class. He tells it to Harvard academia. So that's why I think this speech, it places itself as a kind of watershed moment in history. So I'm going to start with reading the section. Let me just screen share. But any thoughts on the background?
Well, Solzhenitsyn's an interesting guy. I know that I've seen some people express suspicion over the veracity of some of his claims about the gulags and his motivations. I thought the speech itself, though, was pretty prescient and very reminiscent of a lot of the modern authors we read, like Moldbug and Burnham, who actually wrote before Solzhenitsyn. But nothing in here was particularly unfamiliar to me.
I gotta just say a couple things. So first of all, yes, my name is Levi. I have no idea anyone in the entire world whose first name is Levy. But I get that all the time.
I don't know.
but I think, so going through the speech, I thought it was actually better than I expected. And I've read, the only thing I've read from Solzhenitsyn was I read part of the Gulag Archipelago back when Jordan Peterson was a thing, and so I was actually surprised at how in depth and well stated that he put out some of the things that I really liked that he said. So I was impressed with it.
Yeah, is my screen sharing, or do you have to approve it? Oh, thank you.
There it is.
There we go. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Solzhenitsyn comes off as this kind of generalist, and he like makes broad strokes about broad-reaching observations, but really it does seem like he has a serious expertise in each of the topics he's addressing. So I just want to read this first section. This is in the beginning of the speech, but this is where I want to start. So this is the speech. When the modern Western states were created, the following principle was proclaimed. Governments are meant to serve man, and man lives to be free to pursue happiness. See, for example, the American Declaration. Now, at last, during past decades, technical and social progress has permitted the realization of such aspirations, the welfare state. Every citizen has been granted the desired freedom and material goods in such quantity and of such quality as to guarantee, in theory, the achievement of happiness, in the morally inferior sense, which has come into being during those same decades. In the process, however, one psychological detail has been overlooked: the constant desire to have still more things and still better life, and the struggle to obtain them imprints many Western faces with worry and even depression, though it's customary to conceal such feelings. Active, intense competition permeates all human thoughts without opening a way to free spiritual development. The individual's independence from many types of state pressure has been guaranteed. The majority of people have been granted well-being to an extent their fathers and grandfathers could not even dream about. It has become possible to raise young people according to these ideals, leading to physical splendor, happiness, possession of material goods, money, and leisure, to an almost unlimited freedom of enjoyment. So who should now renounce all this? Why and for what should one risk one's precious life in defense of common values? And particularly in such nebulous cases when the security of one's nation must be defended in a distant country. Even biology knows that habitual extreme safety and well-being are not advantageous for a living organism. Today, well-being in the life of Western society has begun to reveal its pernicious mask. Now, I won't read all entire sections, such long quotes, but the ones that I care about the most are the ones that are most long-winded. Yeah, so any thoughts on that?
I think he's completely right.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's so many moments in this where it's what's more to be said, right?
I selected this passage out actually that you just read in my notes that I took, and one of the things I noticed, and this is partially just because I've been reading it recently, but I've been reading where I read Burnham, the Machiavellians, and I was particularly interested in Pareto, and I've sort of been studying in particular Pareto's idea of residues, and class 1 and class 2 residues in particular. And I thought the way he described how the modern Western state is being governed in terms of material interest over spiritual ones maps on directly to what Pareto describes happening in the elite class as they become more of the fox type of archetype who use cunning and manipulation mostly for material ends and become disconnected from the class 2 residues that conserve traditions and family and nationality in a country. And I just found that particularly interesting. I always find it interesting when respectable thinkers sort of arrive at similar conclusions from different points of view. And I find this in much agreement with what people like Moldbug, Burnham, and Pareto have written. And I think his conception is a bit more. Solzhenitsyn offers a more, I think, instinctive understanding of it, whereas Pareto goes through a very logical, mechanistic explanation of how this operates.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of analysis that in the modern world only really, in terms of like Western thinkers, I suppose if you could call Russians Western thinkers, only really Russians have that conception of quality of life that doesn't immediately just boil down to material things, because they're still extremely poor people. You can tell it from their literature, but they still have an understanding of it that I think that perhaps us Western European American types really lack.
Yeah, he definitely gets into that later in the essay, where just the sheer suffering of people in the East has actually made them spiritually more resilient than Westerners. I think Charlemagne was implying the reality that our ruling class has been deracinated by this kind of materialist ideology, and then after that they decide to impose it on the rest of people, and you see how that completely destroys the rest of people who are in situations where they don't have the luxury to avoid the problems with this ideology, unlike the ruling class. So it's
I don't know about that sort of last, or not the last part, but one of the parts you said there, that this spiritual suffering in the East has like made them like stronger. I mean, in a certain sense, that's true, and because I certainly understand how the modern world has destroyed the like spirit of many people in the West, how it's made us atheistic and how it's made us consume and fat and all that type of stuff. But with that said, I mean, Russia, I hear a lot about based Russia, but like Russia's screwed in so many different ways. For one, their life expectancies are pretty bad, and they have really serious problems with stuff like drug abuse or specifically with alcoholism and smoking and stuff like that. Even beyond that, they certainly are not like spiritual is a lot of what's being talked about here. They certainly aren't a religious society at all. I know a lot of people look at Russia and they see some like image of a based Russian Orthodox priest and they assume Russia must be a really religious country. It actually has one of the lowest church attendance rates in the world. It has even lower church attendance rates than many Western countries. And you'd say, well, yeah, that's all legacy of communism, and yes, of course, that's true. But just with what's been said here, that made them like a more hardy people. Are there certain senses in which that's true? I'm sure that's the case, but Russia and many of these Eastern countries have been degraded extremely. Another sort of classic example of this is they have some of the highest abortion rates in the world. So, I don't know if this is necessarily as true as we thought. Sort of another thing, which I'm sure we'll get to a bit more specifically later on, that he mentions in here, is that he says, he talks about the different worlds, that there's the third world, and there's really more than the third world because there's all sorts of different societies that we lump in together in the third world. And they're different than America, and they're sort of going to resist America. Well, I mean, as we see it today, I think it more looks like these are all just sort of being homogenized into the sort of America, UN, globalist empire in a lot of ways. And as America's power sort of declines, maybe that will cease to be the case as much. But as it is currently, that there are many places throughout Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, that all look like they're being sort of homogenized into these same problems that we see in America and other parts of the West.
Yeah, I actually have a lot of personal experience with people from the Eastern Bloc through university. I have very close friends from Moldova, Lithuania, I was very close friends with a girl from Kazakhstan, and I was on pretty good terms with a guy who lived in Moscow. And you're right, they are a more atheistic people, although when they actually encounter religion in a serious sense, they tend to change their mind. But what they do have is the stability of character that a lot of Western people lack. Like at university, one of the universal things I noticed is that Western people broke down quite quickly, particularly when they've been drinking. And this includes Americans, this includes the French, the Spanish, Germans, and things like that.
Well,
but Eastern
definitely
people,
French.
yeah, but the Eastern peoples like Greeks. I was quite good friends with a girl from Thessalonica. Moldovans, like they don't have any of that. They have a certain way about them that's a lot harder that I actually really liked, which is why I talked to so many of them. But I would certainly agree about them not being, a religious people particularly, but they're certainly harder.
Yeah,
so
well,
this
in the chat, Son of Tiamat says, "I didn't know that about Russia. I thought they were going through an Orthodox Renaissance." Now, this is true to a certain extent. I mean, certainly more people are attending divine liturgy in Russia today in 2020 than they would have been in, say, the 1970s when there was state-imposed atheism. So it's like church attendance rates have gone up, and certainly the main way you can see this is identification with Eastern Orthodoxy as a religion in Russia has skyrocketed upwards. So it's like I think like 80% of Russians or something like that, maybe 70% identify as Eastern Orthodox, where in like 1990, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was like 30%. But the problem is that hasn't really translated into actual religious practice for the vast majority of the population. If you actually like ask people how frequently do you attend church, as I said, they have some of the lowest. They still have to this day some of the lowest church attendance rates in the world. It has been going up, so that's positive. And I mean, I'm somewhat optimistic that perhaps 50 years from now, Russia could be more religious than it is now, where a prospect like that doesn't seem possible for most Western countries. But just the idea that it's like super religious or anything like that just isn't the case. It's less religious than most Western countries still. It just, I guess you could say it has some possibility for growth.
There's a line in here that relates to what we're talking about right now, and this line is actually one I noted because it's where Solzhenitsyn is actually the most wrong, and I'll go ahead and read this one. So Solzhenitsyn writes, anguish about our divided world gave birth to the theory of convergence between leading Western countries and the Soviet Union. It is a soothing theory which overlooks the fact that these worlds are not at all developing into similarity. Neither one can be transformed into the other without the use of violence. Besides, convergence inevitably means acceptance of the other side's defects too, and this is hardly desirable. And I think, end quote, and I think that has exactly happened. We actually have converged, the Soviet Union and the United States, and we have inherited each other's defects and not come out really better off one way or the other. The Soviet Union perhaps more materially well off, but certainly spiritually we've both just kind of mutually degraded each other. So I think Solzhenitsyn is extremely wrong about the convergence there, and I think that it's because in large part it was being driven from the United States, the convergence towards this universalistic socialism.
Yeah, there's a couple parts. There's a couple pinpoint parts in the speech. I mean, other than most of it is just like a fountain of truth flowing down to us. But there's a couple parts where it shows he's in this historical circumstance and his anxiety gets to him, and there's still some kind of uncertainty. For example, there's an implication that the East may overtake the West because of the West's such lack of courageousness and willpower. But as we know, we know it actually happened. And Seller kept mentioning about Russia actually being also almost as spiritually dead as the West. And I'd agree with that. And, Solzhenitsyn returned to Russia after the Soviet Union fell. So he ended his exile in 1994. And he went on a tour from Vladivostok all the way to Moscow in Russia. And in the years right after that, his next book was Russia in Collapse. So he did kind of get the idea later in his life that this is not where it should have gone, and we still have serious spiritual struggles in the East. But let's move on to the next part. And
can I say one more thing before we move on?
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment as well on the bit about how the third world is treated. This is actually something Pareto basically predicts as well when he discusses the outcome. Basically, when you have elites of the type that both he and Solzhenitsyn are describing in power, and what he says, Pareto writes that. Quote, wars become essentially economic. Efforts are made to avoid conflicts with the powerful, and the sword is rattled only before the weak. Wars are regarded more than anything else as speculations. A country is often unwittingly edged towards war by nursings of economic conflicts, which, it is expected, will never get out of control and turn into armed conflicts. Not seldom, however, a war will be forced upon a country by peoples who are not so far advanced in the evolution that leads to the predominance of class one residues, and quote. And I think we see that exactly in how the U.S. dealt with the Soviet Union and also these third world countries, particularly in the Middle East, where we basically provoke economic conflicts with them, and occasionally actual conflict, but it's always in this controlled method, and it's always part of an economic speculation and nothing ideological.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. But the next section is in Legalistic Life, and he says this: Western society has given itself the organization best suited to its purposes, based, I would say, on the letter of the law. The limits of human rights and righteousness are determined by a system of laws. Such limits are very broad. People in the West have acquired considerable skill in using, interpreting, and manipulating law, even though laws tend to be too complicated for an average person to understand without the help of an expert. Any conflict is solved according to the letter of law, and this is considered to be the supreme solution. If one is right from a legal point of view, nothing more is required. Nobody may mention that one could still not be entirely right, and urge self-restraint, a willingness to renounce such legal rights, sacrifice, and selfish risk. It would sound simply absurd. One almost never sees voluntary self-restraint. Everybody operates at the extreme limit of those legal frames.
I think this part ties really well into what something that he said earlier in it. And when I read it, it reminded me of Charles Murray's his recent work, and I mean not just the most recent stuff about what was it, something on the subtitles, like something about the state of white America or something like that, but just all of his work about talking about in the most recent book, it's like Fishtown versus whatever the other town is, the sort of the duality of the US, where you have these affluent areas that understand how to follow all of the rules that get us in a good that help you lead a good life, right? But then they want all of the other areas to not worry about the stuff, and there's all the virtue signaling about all the the ridiculous progressive and neoliberal nonsense. But it's like they understand, the elites understand that you can't just that the legal minimum is not sufficient to have a good life, but they don't want anybody else to believe that way. They want the rest of us to just operate on a whatever the legal bare minimum is. That's what they're going to give us, right? And that's what they want us to. That's how they're going to degrade society in ways that benefit them. And so I think I feel like the fact that this speech is so old and it kind of just predicts a lot of the stuff that Murray has talked about recently is really interesting to hear from him. That he saw that kind of stuff coming.
Yeah, I mean the litigiousness of American society is I've never left this great home of mine, but it does seem to be a quirk that's just particular to America and maybe some parts of the Western world. But as the great Tyler Perry said in one of his films, their name is lawyer. It's they're supposed to be good at lying and stuff and stretching the truth, using words on a piece of paper. So. So I wonder why people like lawyers so much.
Yeah, one thing I would say as well is having like a tiny bit of experience with law insofar as it pertains to computers. The problem is that while we might have the system of law, it is so intensely contradictory in certain points. I'm not sure if it could really be called a system.
Ooh, I never thought of that. That's terrible. But
Well,
I think
mean, the real laws, like in actuality, the real laws are those that get enforced.
No, like you can take parts of, say, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation for Europe, and you can hack people to death, like very easily with it. It's like, oh, you preserve my data for 1 nanosecond longer than it was supposed to be. Oh, I can just completely destroy your company and have you fined 20 million euros, right? And then you'll have other places where you can sort of, massage the lines and massage the wording. I mean, like you read, for example, the books on privacy which underlie this legal system, and you're getting quotations from people like Rousseau and Locke, who aren't exactly the systematized thinkers that at least I'm used to when I read medieval theologians, right? That they're not really systematic thinkers, and so that kind of leads to a chaos in anything that sort of proceeds from their ideas. And so I don't think I'd call it a system.
Yeah, but Settler is right. The real laws are the ones that get enforced, and this is actually one of the things that I don't think Solzhenitsyn was predicting. Where there's the anarcho tyranny of there's all these informal laws that aren't dependent on the formal structure. There's these informal laws that do get enforced, and formal laws that don't, and then whichever ones that are written down that are preferable, they're the ones that get selectively enforced. But he really focuses on basically how Western society has gone sola scriptura to the extreme. And I actually think that his criticism here is perfectly encapsulates what's wrong with the modern conservative movement, because we know that, especially in the courts and the legal traditions of conservative thought, they're so dependent on just legalism without moral values predicating behind it, as long as it's done legally, as the phrase that we know said. So I think he's actually identifying that part of our society that is just taken for granted.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem we have with the Republican Party, right? It's like they'll capitulate on anything as long as all the rules were followed when the capitulation occurred, right? I mean, it's there's no. I mean, this happens with Adam Smith too, right? People talk about, well, Adam Smith was in favor of all this, libertarian legal framework because he assumed that people were going to have this fundamental Christian worldview, and they weren't going to be jackasses and just basically treat people the way Solzhenitsyn says we do, right? Just that whatever is legal, that's whatever we can get away with legally, that's the minimum. There is no other standard.
They'll be completely fine with the absolute dissolution and destruction of the traditional American nation, as long as it fits and is organized really well into their file cabinet. As long as that happens, yeah, they're going to be fine with it. But I just want to go from another angle here, where we know social trust in general has declined over this entire period from World War II to the 1970s and the 1970s to now. And as long as that continues to happen, people would naturally go towards relying on these formal structures of law and these systemic rules more and more, instead of depending on their fellow man and all that good stuff. So you get the idea there. But
something on this legalism mode of government as well. This is basically also something that Pareto talks about in terms of how an elite of this type would govern. Basically, governing through combinations, manipulations, diplomacy, fraud, and cunning, and basically they don't use force generally, if at all, to actually do battle with other parts of the elite. What they actually do is simply they'll come up with combinations of economic manipulations, political manipulations, in this case legalisms, and whatever combination can successfully defeat the other combinations. And you see this through like the living constitution and the way English common law works through precedents, right? Whoever can come up with a winning combination of various elements that are more or less arbitrarily taken, right? Because you can often find various combinations of law and case law to support either side of a complex case. This is the way an elite of this type governs, and we see that now, where it's the same thing, where you know, in the modern world, the government of the United States basically only exists to perpetuate itself through various forms of corruption and cunning, and doesn't really have anything to do with it lacks a tie to the actual people it is supposed to govern at this point, which is also something that Pareto exists. And this is actually a consequence of elites of a certain type coming to power, because when elites who come to power through the use of combinations, basically combining various elements, they actually perpetuate the growth of that type of elite, and eventually they move so far away from elites who are using force against one another, as has happened in the past, that it becomes the only matter in which they govern. So hence, when we see any external threats now, right, like China is the big external threat now, right, the only way we can even our ruling class could even conceive of dealing with that threat is through these various legalisms and combinations of economic regulation, etc. The entire world is basically governed at this point, and it actually makes the country really weak against that external threat, because a country like China is more of the class 2 type, right, that is actually willing to use force, as you see in the South China Sea. That's a really good example where you actually see this in effect, where our ruling elite are no longer capable to use force in any sense against any external threat. The only way they actually can govern is in this legalistic fashion, and it's actually the only way they can compete with each other as well.
Yeah, it's sort of I guess you could say that, like, Vietnam and how much of a disaster that was for America, and how it could have been won so easily by a confident civilization. Like, a lot of people get the idea from Vietnam that there were like all these based Viet Cong soldiers hiding under hiding under bushes or whatever, taking out 10 Americans for every one of them that died or something like that. It was like nothing like that. I can't remember the ratio exactly, but I do remember
it was the exact opposite or something like that. Even relative to the South Vietnamese forces, they lost millions of Viet Cong.
Yeah. They lost. I remember the overall casualty count was double for the north of what it was in this, double for the northern side for what it was for the American side. But even on the American side, the vast majority of the losses were the Vietnamese forces. The Americans, they did lose some people, obviously, but it was a tiny fraction of what the northern Vietnamese lost. But even just comparing the north to south, it was 2 to 1 there. So, the Americans could have won that if they wanted to, and any confident civilization would have. And I'm not even here to say that necessarily would have been a better thing. Like, I don't know, would it really have mattered that much in the long term if the South won the Vietnam War? I don't know. I mean, maybe it would have, maybe it wouldn't. I'm not really sure at this point. But the point I'm making is the sort of situation where we are now, where police forces in America can't keep order in, say, Portland or Minneapolis or whatever. This is just sort of the logical continuation of the American military being unable to prosecute what should have been a relatively simple war in Vietnam.
I mean, they could if they had half the brutality that people say they do.
Yeah, the only reason they're able to successfully use the strategy of slandering them about them being so brutal and evil is precisely because they're not brutal and evil. So it's kind of ironic there. But is it okay to move on to the next section?
Yeah, I think so. I could even say more things about Pareto here if you want, unless you're getting tired of it.
Oh, trust me,
I'm happy to hear more about Pareto.
So on the Vietnam War part, that was interesting because Solzhenitsyn comments that section's basically about the short-sightedness of the United States, which is very true, and it's also something baked into Pareto's social analysis, basically, in that these class 1 type individuals, unlike the class 2 who are connected to basically the conservative principle, they're only really living for the present. Every problem they view as some sort of as a novelty, and they seek to basically tackle that problem as it presents itself without much regard for the preservation of any previous combination, right? So the class 2 more conservative residue is the drive to basically preserve any combination of elements that has been set up, right? And this can be like a religion, a nation, etc. The class 1 type residue is always just looking at creating new combinations to solve any particular present problem. That's not and it's not forward looking because it's not actually connected to any sort of tradition anymore. So the disconnect from any sort of respect for preserving things that already exist is actually what creates the short-sightedness. You actually need that conservative element in your society to some extent in order to ensure that it's actually looking at the future. And that's why we see this short-sightedness in the elite. And the further we get from the elite being connected in any way to the traditions of the people they're supposed to be governing, and I think now we're basically at the end of that line. Like I said earlier, the elite purely exist to perpetuate their own corruption at this point. The short-sightedness is going to continue to basically snowball. And even with the bill you see now in Congress, right, with the relief funds and all these trillions of dollars for other countries, I mean, the United States has gone way past the point of no return on its economic spending, right? There's no long-term solution. There's hardly even a solution within a year in advance, right, in terms of what the United States is doing economically.
Yeah, wasn't it something like 35% of all of the US dollars were printed this year or something?
Yes, literally 35% were created this year, which is like now we're getting closer to like actual hyperinflation tier hockey stick looking stuff, right? I mean, if that continues.
If only there was something we could do about that. You definitely wouldn't find any solution over at the second most recent video I made at my channel, so don't take a look at that. But I'm just gonna go to this is, if we haven't gotten to juicy stuff already, this is an extra juicy part. It's about freedom. So he says, it is feasible and easy everywhere to undermine administrative power, and in fact, it has been drastically weakened in all Western countries. The defense of individual rights has reached such extremes as to make society as a whole defenseless against certain individuals. It is time in the West to defend not so much human rights as human obligations. Destructive and irresponsible freedom has been granted boundless space. Society appears to have little defense against the abyss of human decadence, such as, for example, misuse of liberty for moral violence against young people, motion pictures full of pornography, crime, and horror. It is considered to be part of freedom and theoretically counterbalanced by the young people's right not to look at it or not to accept it. Life organized legalistically has thus shown its inability to defend itself against the corrosion of evil. Yeah, moment of silence. That's good.
Yeah,
Sorry,
so I
you
actually
stunned me with your brilliance.
It was Solzhenitsyn.
That line actually is an old Mark Levin joke. He's a total boomer con, but he still holds a special place in my heart.
I don't know why though.
He was one. He actually was the first person to ever introduce me to the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. He talked about that a lot.
Ooh, that's kind of impressive, but I mean this passage right here just shows he's kind of attacking their golden calf, isn't he? Like, it's just freedom qua freedom, and it's pointless, and it'll naturally lead to moral decay, because there's nothing forcefully stopping that from happening. People are going to choose to decay.
It actually, like he says, it leads to defenselessness. This is another passage I took notes on, and in Burnham's analysis of Pareto, he actually is applying his analysis to his own era in the 40s, right? And he actually remarks on how the Allied powers were basically defenseless against the Axis powers, right, and also the Soviet Union as well, because they had basically developed a form of debilitating humanitarianism, which prevented them from actually using force against the Axis powers before they got out of control, right? So I think what he's commenting on here is this effect that happens when a certain type of elite remains in power for too long, where they actually cripple their ability to act through overwhelming concern for humanitarianism and become unable to use force against certain individuals, as Solzhenitsyn writes, to actually preserve the society. And of course, we see that this year with the riots, right? Like the riots were not could only be dealt with in a diplomatic fashion, and were not met with force at any point.
See, this makes me think of how much of a moderate position that is, because the more extreme position would be that that the riots and all that stuff are intended by the elites, right? Like it's not that you're refusing to use force against them because of humanitarian concerns. You're not using force against them because you want them to do that, right? Because I mean, they're certainly not that way when it comes to any sort of right-wing protest, and I don't know if we've gotten to the point in the speech yet where he talks about the media, but the media is like, I mean, to the extent that the media can do anything to convince the state to be violent against someone, it's certainly been that way against any kind of right-wing, anti-lockdown protest. I mean, the yellow vest folks in France, I mean, not that they're necessarily right-wing, but good grief. I mean, there's all kinds of violence against them. But, you get certain other groups that are rioting or doing whatever they're doing, and there's no violence from the state to be seen.
Of course, Ben, and obviously the riots are desirable by the ruling elite, but there is a class of competing elite that is attempting to emerge right now, namely Trump, right? And there are sections of elite in power who actually oppose these things, but they themselves are under the same debilitating effects where they're actually unable to meet force with force. The only way that the rioters could be dealt with was through some sort of diplomatic solution.
I suppose they remember the Kent State riots and don't want to end up like killing somebody.
Right.
Well, that's probably true, right? But that's part of this overwhelming humanitarian belief, right? Where how much violence do you allow from one side at the risk of some amount of violence in stopping it from happening. But the fact of the matter is, as we observe, force is simply necessary as a part of maintaining a civilization, right? And a civilization will become totally debilitated when its humanitarian aims prevent it from ever using force, even when there's a situation when force is being used against them.
The second section of the direction of freedom part that we just read is exactly on the point of criminality. So I just want to put it in here for the topic. And what shall we say about the dark realm of criminality as such? Legal frames, especially in the US, are broad enough to encourage not only individual freedom, but also certain individual crimes. The culprit can go unpunished or obtain undeserved leniency with the support of thousands of public defenders. When a government starts an earnest fight against terrorism, public opinion immediately accuses it of violating the terrorists' civil rights. There are many such cases. Such a tilt of freedom in the direction of evil has come about gradually, but it was evidently born primarily out of a humanistic and benevolent concept according to which there is no evil inherent to human nature. The world belongs to mankind, and all the defects of life are caused by wrong social systems which must be corrected. Strangely enough, though the best social conditions have been achieved in the West, there still is criminality, and there even is considerably more of it than in the pauper and lawless Soviet society. So he's addressing the things you guys were just mentioning. A narco-tyranny is kind of aided and abetted by this ridiculous legalism where you're going through combinations instead of just actually using simple force.
And you hear it all the time. It's like, it's a private company. They can do whatever they want, right? And the left will absolutely shriek about corporations all day long until a corporation's doing what they want them to do. And then they say, it's a private company. You can't object to that.
Actually, the YouTuber V, though he's quite cringe in quite a few ways, he has a really great phrase for that phenomena from the left. He describes it as tactical anarcho-capitalism, when when a lefty they probably have hammer and sickle, BLM, ACAB in their bio, but then they say it's a private company, it can do whatever it wants.
Actually, I've got an important question, and I'm asking you guys hear this, but also the audience as well, all 184 of you. How do you think people would react if they took, say, 20 of these rioters and they splayed them out in like a public place and they gave them 70 lashes each?
Such a thing could never even happen.
Yeah, but if it wouldn't happen, right? But I'm just for the sake of argument, how do you think they would react?
Every single city and every inch of this country would immediately stop rioting, and the newspapers wouldn't show up about it, and then everyone would just be absolutely petrified. It would be
well,
I don't know if that's good,
it depends. If it was like an isolated case of just like one sheriff somewhere doing that, then he would be like imprisoned and it would all stop. The sort of point is, like, if the government wanted this to stop, they could do it, and they wouldn't even need to do anything nearly that drastic. If the government was generally willing to take drastic measures like that, then, I mean, this wouldn't even be a problem in the first case. And if somehow there was just a radical shift in the government where the government was suddenly like, yeah, we're doing this stuff, then it would stop pretty quickly. But I suppose just the problem with that example is it's so radical and sort of out of left field that's sort of hard to conceptualize.
Yeah, I think they'd freak out, and I think they'd shut up.
Well, yeah, it actually would work, I believe. That is the proper solution to handling a problem like that. It probably would stop the rioters, and I think the public, to a large part, actually would accept it. But
I don't know.
Part of the problem, I think there's a sufficient number of people who would be very pleased to see that happen, and the problem is that the people who aren't don't have the motivation in them to actually do anything about it. That's
don't have the gumption.
Yeah,
like
the public opinion on that matter would be irrelevant, because the people who are bothered by it wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And if a few select people decided to do more riots, it would be met with equivalent force, right? Obviously, if this is the new policy, right? So
yeah, like, think about it, right? Like, you've got all these people like looting stores and yelling about problems like genders or whatever, and things that are pretty much inconceivable to the vast majority of people. If you had like a couple of policemen, like say 20 policemen and a guy with a drum, right, just in like the center of New York City, right, and you just gathered together these Antifa leaders and just gave them that punishment, I don't think there would be many more riots somehow.
Yeah, the problem is we have this conception that, like, the opinion and sentiment of the masses necessarily matters in this way. What actually matters is what certain organized minorities are able to do.
Media.
Exactly.
Well, the media also doesn't matter if you're using force, right? If you're meeting this type of manipulative mode of government or political action with force, there's nothing it can actually do against that, right? So the only extent to which opposition to that matters is to what degree it would be opposed by force, and it would basically be eliminated almost instantly.
I just want to acknowledge that not only someone said it was 185 viewers, it's edging towards 200 viewers. This is some of the best ratings that has been brought to Settler Stream. So I just wanted to.
200's like pretty normal.
No, just saying, it's amazing. It's the best ratings. It's great ratings when we do these topics.
That is true. Speaking of which, I guess I should get to the one super chat I have. If anyone wants to leave more super chats, they're very welcome. And for that matter, if you're a donor on Subscribestar or Patreon, and if you would like to become a donor on Subscribestar or Patreon, I'm happy to read any questions that you send me. But the one super chat, Son of Tiamat, for $5, tells Charlemagne, I love his chat with Woes. It gave me some new insights.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I thought that was a good stream. I'm almost finished the script for the video on that, which I'm actually referencing quite a lot in this stream, in pair with the notes I took on Solzhenitsyn. I think Burnham's The Machiavellians is really key reading for everyone at this point, if you haven't read it.
Shoot, I'll write that down. Is it okay if we move on to the lying evil press?
Well, let me just say on that note, if I can actually cite the Machiavellians again, this is a really interesting passage from Perito that Burnham cites. that's very relevant to what we're talking about. The interesting thing about these riots is that the left couldn't even stop them really if they wanted, right? Because they lack the spine to do it. And I think that's one of the reasons the riots are particularly dangerous, is because they do want them, but they also lack the will to actually control them, I think. I don't think that the left, the politicians would actually be able to do what is necessary to control them were they to truly get out of control. So Pareto writes on this, quote, "A mere handful of citizens, so long as they are willing to use violence, can force their will upon public officials who are not inclined to meet violence with equal violence. If the reluctance of the officials to resort to force is primarily motivated by humanitarian sentiments, that result ensures very readily, but if they refrain from violence because they deem it wiser to use some other means, the effect is often the following. To prevent or resist violence, the governing class resorts to diplomacy, fraud, corruption. Governmental authority passes, in a word, from the lions to the foxes. The governing class bows its head under the threat of violence, but it surrenders only in appearances, trying to turn the flank of the obstacle. It cannot demolish in a frontal attack. In the long run, that sort of procedure comes to exercise a far-reaching influence on the selection of the governing class, which is now recruited only from the foxes, while the lions are blackballed." End quote. And I think this is really interesting because we see the left handling the rioters this way, the whole BLM group, right? Whereas they do sort of oppose it in a way, even though it's tactically useful, and they try to deflect, re-aim, and never attack it directly, right? They need to keep this whole BLM and rioting under a certain degree of control, but they have no means to actually meet it with force, which is the only true way to control it. So they are in a sense bound to its will, even though at the highest level they tend to they can mostly ignore BLM, right? Like we would expect Biden to do that, but to a certain extent, because some of their power comes from these people, they are actually bound to meet their interest to some degree, right? And this actually puts the elite in a very dangerous situation, because now you're in a situation where a small group of violent people can actually force their will onto the politicians to some degree.
Chaz was another clear example of that, right?
Chaz is a perfect example of that. And like I said, the important note here is not that the elites don't, the ruling elite tactically benefit from these anarchist events, to put it that way. But at the same time, they are also unable to fully control them because they don't have the will to meet force with force, right? So they are actually at the mercy of these minority groups to some extent. It's a small extent, but it is there and it will actually influence them.
Yeah, kind of related to this, this whole discussion about the balance between violent mobs and leaders that are ineffectual reminds me very strongly of an article written by Edward Fazer called "Woke Ideology is a Psychological Disorder," where he actually points out, if this is the correct article, I think it is, that Plato saw this coming in Book 9 of his Republic, because he foresaw, a morally undisciplined class of people who are willing to use violence precisely because they couldn't control themselves, they were violent, asserting dominance over an increasingly ineffectual elite under what he calls democracy, and this eventually leading to tyranny.
Right, because when only one group is willing to use force, there's only one logical outcome of that, right? No matter how powerful the elites are in terms of their ability to economically manipulate and socially and propaganda and manipulate through the media, right? At the end of the day, if they are willing to submit to force, then that force inevitably will affect them and the larger society.
Well, yeah, you can only pay them off for so long before one of them gets smart and realizes he can just take power.
Right. I think this is something Machiavelli himself wrote, but he comments on feudal lordship basically, and no matter how wealthy and powerful a feudal lord might be, if you don't actually have the army to back it up, you don't actually really have anything, right? And we saw that Machiavelli experienced that in his time in Italy.
Yeah. All right. So the next section is on the press. This is what he says. The press, too, of course, enjoys the widest freedom. I shall be using the word press to include all media. But what sort of use does it make of this freedom? Here again, the main concern is not to infringe the letter of the law. There is no moral responsibility for deformation or disproportion. What sort of responsibility does a journalist have to his readers or to history? If they have misled public opinion or the government by inaccurate information or wrong conclusions, do we know of any cases of public recognition and rectification of such mistakes by the same journalist or the same newspaper? No, it does not happen, because it would damage sales. A nation may be the victim of such a mistake, but the journalist always gets away with it. One may safely assume that he will start writing the opposite with renewed self-assurance. So yeah,
This is
big news.
This is mostly really right, but there's one part of it which I feel like he doesn't totally understand the whole system well enough, where he says, no, it will damage sales. And I mean, that's true, and I'm sure that's a part of the sort of thinking pattern of the media, but I think that sort of misses the more ideological obsession that these people have and the institutional legitimacy that they're trying to maintain. The issue isn't just that it will damage sales. I mean, you can print all sorts of crazy stuff and be a very successful tabloid, and it could be well known that you retract stuff regularly, or that a lot of the stuff you print isn't true. But that's not the business model, and more importantly, that's not the sort of persona that our real mainstream media wants to have. The sort of persona that they want to have is that they're the arbiters of truth. They're the ones that put out what is really true. So if they can really admit that they're getting stuff wrong constantly, then it's not so much the money that's the problem. It's the institutional legitimacy that they'll lose. That's the problem. And
it's
from
like
that, it's the dominance of their ideology.
It's like polls. The poll isn't the purpose of the poll isn't to find out what people think. It's to tell people what to think. Same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think Solzhenitsyn's probably a little bit still stuck in the economic view of this conflict, which makes sense as communism versus capitalism, defines the Cold War. But there is a lot more to what the media was doing in his time, and the elite in general, than simply making money. I thought the whole bit on the media was very Moldbugian, particularly the part where he asks, who elected them, basically. And also that the press is actually the greatest power in Western countries, more powerful than the legislature. I mean, that some of this is, something you'd find in Moldbug's open letter, basically, word for word.
Yeah, that is definitely the second part of it, is that he, coming from an Eastern society where he knows it's clearly a state-controlled press, he just, it likely became easier for him to see that there's this press-controlled state situation in America and in the West at large. But I definitely agree with Settler. It's not just about the money. He's forgetting the status and power and vision that they want to impose on the world. And that's essential to understanding their zealotry and fanaticism. It's quite scary, because the media people are, in fact, along with some of the academics, the most left-wing people in the society. The journalists, how they live, and their lifestyle, and where they live, and what they do is radically more left-wing than any small business owner or any family.
Yeah, I thought the whole press-controlled state thing might seem kind of trite to us at this point, but it actually is a really important insight that, as Moldbug writes, our linguistics actually sort of are designed to prevent us from even thinking about that concept. But actually explaining that to people in the correct terms, as I think Solzhenitsyn was doing here, is really important. Very, very interesting that he would give this speech, to the perhaps primary institution that's actually producing some of these media elites, right? Because this is given at Harvard.
Yeah, it's so strange, because he says all these things to the very belly of the beast, and of course, they ignore it, but we can get to that later.
Well, do they ignore it? I mean, I don't know. He's basically telling them that you rule and the legislature doesn't, right? So,
they're probably just based, but they didn't take all. That's the issue.
Oh, you cut out there a bit.
Well, they were probably sitting there thinking, based, but the problem is they didn't take all of his criticisms to heart, and they basically ignored it. But I'll save that for the very end, because it's interesting to see their reactions of some of these media and newspapers to the speech. Well, the next section, I'm just going to skip to a later part, because we chew on each section, is about the loss of willpower in the West. He says this, and yet, no weapons, no matter how powerful, can help the West until it overcomes its loss of willpower. In a state of psychological weakness, weapons become a burden for the capitulating side. To defend oneself, one must also be ready to die. There is little such readiness in a society raised in the cult of material well-being. Nothing is left, then, but concessions, attempts to gain time and betrayal. Thus, at the shameful Belgrade Conference, free Western diplomats, in their weakness, surrendered the line where enslaved members of Helsinki watch groups are sacrificing their lives. So not only is it this, and that's the end of the part, not only is it about the ruling class being extremely weak and unwilling to use force in any circumstance, it's also about how they're willing to go along with managed decline. Like you said, there's nothing left but concessions. So they continue to do that. And they just continue to centralize power and extract from the people below them as they ride this thing out. And that's kind of shameful.
There's no fire in them. It's always like social games.
Yeah, it's so performative too. How they play the game in public. It's kind of,
I mean, and it's not just something that goes on up in the really high echelons of power either. This is a common middle class thing. It's like always,
yeah. The bourgeois left wing are you can see when you talk to these people that they are kind of performative and self-effacing, and always with the impression that they don't really care what they're saying. They just don't like you, and they want to play games to defeat you.
Oh no, it's always great to run the script against them. Right, they don't know what to do. They get a bit bamboozled.
Right, but they don't care in the end if you're right or not. But I still do think there's an essentially performative quality to how they go along with their script.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this sort of gets into the distinction between the formal ideology of the elites versus the real one, and basically everything the modern politician says in public is a post hoc formalization that covers their actual real beliefs. And this paragraph in particular, I thought also again gets into the whole unwillingness to use force paradigm. Basically the class one ruling elite believes that they can simply come up with combinations of weapon systems and various military units and not actually use them and perpetuate their power that way. Even in the wars you do see the U.S. actually conduct, right? It's actually fairly low level compared to its total military strength and the way we used to conduct wars, right? So like we have all these incredibly advanced weapons, but the unwillingness of the elite to actually use force basically nullifies a lot of this advantage, right? And again, you see this in terms of how we deal with China looking to expand its power into the Pacific Ocean, where the United States clearly dominates, but they're so unwilling to risk force being used at all that despite having overwhelming advantage, they won't engage in that because they're so interested in material prospects, right? They're not willing to actually damage the short-term material interests in some sort of actual conflict.
Yeah, I guess we can get around to a couple more super chats. TK22 or TK22 tongue, I don't know, some sort of East Asian sounding name, for $10 says, "It seems Heinlein had a point, just not quite woke enough on democracy." This is, of course, for those of you who are unaware, referring to the author of Starship Troopers. I always thought that the sort of Starship Troopers service guaranteed citizenship sort of model sounds quite interesting, because it's very different than it's very different than any sort of democracy that we're familiar with. But we of course have seen many countries with national service, but the sort of point of the Starship Troopers model is, in a lot of countries that have national service, it's not really that strenuous. I mean, I'm not trying to say that's not more difficult than your average job. Probably is, but still, the sort of national service you have to do for a year is not on the scale of what is shown in Starship Troopers, and it's also a very self-selected group, because it's only people that are actually willing to sign up for this that get the citizenship and get the ability to vote. So it's an interesting thought experiment, though I doubt we're going to see anything like that anytime soon. Anyone have anything to say about Starship Troopers?
Oh, I actually saw it and watched it.
I was too busy buying more Ethereum. But here is and I'm going to read this entire section too, because I do believe
I'm doing super chats. Are you not listening to me?
Oh, sorry. I forgot.
Oof. I mean, one thing I would say is that the film kind of had the Warhammer 40,000 effect, where it started out as this kind of mockery, or they attempted to make it some sort of mockery of authoritarianism and instead made it look really cool.
Yeah. It's because the sort of like liberals that produce it, they think anything other than liberal democracy is like 1930s. So I think they just kind of assumed that must be what Starship Troopers is.
Lol, macho men shooting bugs. Like, who would possibly want that? Ha ha ha. Turns out most people do.
Yeah.
They don't like that because they feel they sympathize with the Bugman.
Yeah, there's actually a really good video by Missing the Mark on these sorts of writers who will do things like, like in the comic books, how there'll be like the nerdy kid who resents the jocks or whatever, and the jocks have like these really glaring character flaws, and how in real life they really genuinely don't have that, right? Like it's like the sort of writers that make these sorts of films come from an entirely different and alien perspective from the rest of society, so it just kind of balks their expectations, and it leads to this sort of 40K effect, I think. And I think that the Starship Troopers is probably one of the best examples of that.
Yeah, well, I believe the author actually wasn't just a normal like progressive, but the makers of the movie were.
I mean the movie.
Correctly.
Yeah, okay. I mean the movie, yeah. I don't mean the book. The book, I know that Heinlein said that specialization was for insects. Can you imagine telling that to a group of academics?
But yeah, moving on. Nicholas, I don't know, I'm not going to try and pronounce your last name, for $5 says, "I don't think the public would accept the public displays of aggressive acts towards rioters. It would be split." I mean, again, it's impossible, I think, really to sort of conceptualize this fully in like modern society, because it's something that's just like so wild that it's just like, what would happen. It's like, what if Donald Trump announced that he was going to restore the feudal monarchy? It's one thing to imagine Donald Trump declaring the end of American democracy. I mean, that is wild enough, but it's a whole nother thing to say, oh, I'm going back 1,000 years.
The lashings example is like pretty over the top, right? But I think you could do, I mean, if something like that were done, yes, public opinion would be very split on it, but public opinion is only relevant to the elite when they depend on minority interest groups that are directed by public opinion. If you're transitioning into a different type of power, particularly with force involved, public opinion just becomes irrelevant, unless that public opinion is going to, influence significant force against you, which I don't think it would. I don't really see some sort of, I don't see significant groups emerging to oppose the government of either the state or the federal government with force were to actually use force against the rioters. So, we're the problem with this example is like we are governed by public opinion, right? And But once you break out of that, then you're in a totally different way of thinking about it. So I would say the more salient point is just recognizing that public opinion wouldn't matter nearly as much as it does when the riots are dealt with diplomatically.
Yeah, I think sort of absent of specific examples, the sort of general point is the government could very easily end these riots and stuff like this if it wanted to. It just needs to have the willpower to do what is necessary, which isn't even anything that extreme.
No, it's not even extreme, right?
Yeah, it's like not having mass violence in your major cities is like the most basic thing you could ask from the government.
It's so sad. Oh, someone was asking in the chat if what we thought about Solzhenitsyn's associate Igor Shaferovich, and I'm sure I'm not familiar with him. Most people aren't familiar with him, but he mentions it in the speech. And basically, Shaferovich is a mathematician in the Soviet sciences, and he basically just debunks socialism. And so I guess that was pretty brave and impressive. So that's good.
And one more super chat popped in here, so we can get back to the speech. But let's do this quick. Zero Kev for $5. I believe Moldbug talked about Plato's Republic, Woke similarity in technology, communism, and the Brown Scare. I mean, probably it's been a while since I read that essay from him, but I would not be surprised if he talked about it in that. All right, sorry, I don't really have anything else to say, but thank you very much for the donation.
All right. Sorry to be so oblivious to the super chats.
No worries. And of course, everyone remember you can donate to me on Subscribestar, on Patreon. You can buy my T-shirts that on Teespring. There are many wonderful ways to donate to Settlers Lament.
Yeah. All right. This section is a doozy, and I just want to read it in whole. Humanism and its consequences, parentheses, have been a disaster for the human race. But this is what he says. How has this unfavorable relation of forces come about? How did the West decline from its triumphal march to its present sickness? Have there been fatal turns and losses of direction in its development? It doesn't seem so. The West kept advancing socially in accordance with its proclaimed intentions, with the help of brilliant technological progress. And all of a sudden, it found itself in its present state of weakness. This means that the mistake must be at the root, at the very basis of human thinking in the past centuries. I refer to the prevailing Western view of the world, which was first born during the Renaissance and found its political expression from the period of the Enlightenment. It became the basis for government and social science and could be defined as rationalistic humanism or humanistic autonomy, the and enforced autonomy of man from any higher force above him. It could also be called anthropocentricity, with man seen as the center of everything that exists. So this is the part where it's just explicitly reactionary, where we're getting with the fundamental problems of modernity. I just love that he goes there. He goes all the way, and it's not just some surface level critiques. But I mean, do you want me to continue in this section? Because the next two paragraphs are good too.
Yeah, go on if you like.
Yeah. So the second part is this. The turn introduced by the Renaissance evidently was inevitable historically. The Middle Ages had come to a natural end by exhaustion, becoming an intolerable despotic repression of man's physical nature in favor of the spiritual one. Then, however, we turned our backs upon the spirit and embraced all that is material with excessive and unwarranted zeal. This new way of thinking, which had imposed on us its guidance, did not admit the existence of intrinsic evil in man, nor did it see any higher task than the attainment of happiness on earth. It based modern Western civilization on the dangerous trend to worship man and his material needs. Everything beyond physical well-being and accumulation of material goods, all other human requirements and characteristics of a subtler and higher nature, were left outside the area of attention of state and social systems, as if human life did not have any superior sense. that provided access for evil, of which in our days there is a free and constant flow. Merely freedom does not in the least solve all the problems of human life, and it even adds a number of new ones. Yeah. The only thing he got wrong there was that it was intolerable and despotic, the Middle Ages and its repression of physical nature. Sounds good to me, but yeah.
I don't know where he's talking about. Like maybe in Russia, but in the High Middle Ages, it was surprisingly liberal.
Terrible. Should have been. Sorry. And then the last paragraph is this. However, in early democracies, as in American democracy at the time of its birth, all individual human rights were granted because man is God's creature. That is, freedom was given to the individual conditionally, in the assumption of his constant religious responsibility. Such was the heritage of the preceding 1,000 years. 200 or even 50 years ago, it would have seemed quite impossible in America that an individual could be granted boundless freedom simply for the satisfaction of his instincts or whims. Subsequently, however, all such limitations were discarded everywhere in the West. A total liberation occurred from the moral heritage of Christian centuries with their great reserves of mercy and sacrifice. State systems were becoming increasingly and totally materialistic. The West ended up by truly enforcing human rights, sometimes even excessively, but man's sense of responsibility to God and society grew dimmer and dimmer. In the past decades, the legalistically selfish aspect of Western approach and thinking has reached its final dimension, and the world wound up in a harsh spiritual crisis and political impasse. All the glorified technological achievements of progress, including the conquest of outer space, do not redeem the 20th century's moral poverty, which no one could imagine even as late as in the 19th century. There's actually one guy that did predict all of that, and his name was Tom Carlyle.
I was that last bit's interesting because again, Pareto actually does write about this. But fair to Solzhenitsyn for not necessarily knowing him or Carlyle or every single person. But I think a lot of what Solzhenitsyn observed after the fact was predicted by many other people. I'll quote Pareto again. He says, in this situation, quote, policies of the governing class are not planned too far ahead in time. Predominance of the combination instincts and enfeeblement of the sentiments of group persistence result in making the governing class more satisfied with the present and less thoughtful of the future. The individual comes to prevail, and by far over family, community, and nation. Material interests and interests of the present or near future come to prevail over the ideal interest of the community or nation and interests of the distant future. The impulse is to enjoy the present without too much thought for the morrow. End quote. Of course, that's written over 100 years ago, right? So I think people do have an understanding on a technical level of the results of this type of humanitarian and ideology dominating your society for too long, as it has in the United States. As he points out, it was built on that in the first place, right? Which is sort of a fundamental problem Americans have to figure out how to deal with, I think, in this current crisis.
I'm just so glad he wrote it in one place. Like the critique of humanism in just 4 paragraphs, and all that you need to hear is there. So that's why I love this speech so much. There's so many parts that are just like that.
And as you guys can see, I have recently received an endorsement from Vosh. If you would like to own the same T-shirt as this one that he's wearing, go to my Teespring.
You love to see it, don't you? Yeah.
But I don't know, Renaissance Man. Do you have any? Do you have any ability to debunk these medieval myths a bit more?
Well, just read the history, really. There's often this assumption that they were very impersonal times filled with phenomenally stupid people. And while there were some strange instances in the Middle Ages, like the time a bunch of peasants tried to prosecute a duck for magic or something, you also read in like phenomenally intelligent people Aquinas is the one that sticks out. I'm sure pretty much everybody here has heard of St. Thomas Aquinas. But this extends to pretty much all fields. The philosophers themselves, and even to some extent what you would call primitive scientists, were strictly speaking better educated in a wider range of fields than modern scientists. So they didn't have this problem of over-specialization. So, for example, all of these scientists knew Latin. Everything was written in Latin, which wasn't their first tongue. It was a highly complicated, it's obviously a highly complicated language for communicating things. The mere fact that they were able to sit and do that shows that they were above and beyond 95% of people in today's society who can't even sit down and learn French, let alone Latin. Not only that, they were also raised, I'm talking about the intellectuals here, not necessarily the lower classes, but the intellectuals and the nobility were around far more stringent educational standards than we have today. The trivium is one example of one of the systems they used. They were taught from a very young age, the higher classes I'm saying, of course, Latin through various monasteries and through various schools, although developed schools like seminaries and the Jesuit schools came a lot later on. They were also exposed to ideas that were less crazy. They were subjected to Aristotle and to Ovid and to Plato, as opposed to, I suppose, reconstituted Foucault and Nietzsche. Just basically, simply put, the standard of humanities education was far, far, far higher. And contrary to popular belief, humanities matter a lot more than sciences. I say this as someone doing a graduate degree in the sciences. And so as a consequence, you had more people who were more in touch with reality in the higher classes than they are now. Because if you're reading, say, Rousseau, I mean, it's pie in the sky compared to, I don't know, Bonaventure or Alexander of Hales. And these are, I'm talking about theologians here. And this, of course, permeated the whole society and led to a far more disciplined society. Also, the fact that everyone went to church meant that they actually learnt morals. There wasn't this idea that, morals were just subjective, bro. People actually followed the laws. And consequently, in fact, Ivan the Heathen has a video on this. The laws were far less stringent. They didn't even need written constitutions because people just knew the moral law well enough that they wouldn't offend against them. This, of course, didn't stop things like crime. But it did lead to a more peaceful society and also a more modest one, I think I'd say. This is just me spieling, like just out of what comes into my head because I was like reading something else. But
there was some interesting idea. I can't remember which stream it was said on, but someone said that history is basically written by nerds. So all we basically have are the accounts from nerds on how most people were actually living, and of course those are going to tend to be biased in a certain way. Obviously, there are accounts that offer better insight into how most people who weren't intellectuals actually lived. But I think that's something to remember when you're reading about what it was like at this time period. Remember, it's not the random medieval peasant who's actually writing these tomes about what his life was like, right? It's literally nerds doing it.
Yeah, I agree, but what you've got to remember is that the standard of nerd was much, much higher.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they're certainly much higher than our standard as well. So I'm not saying they're even wrong necessarily or deliberately misleading or something, but there is also that perspective. And I think as you get into the nerds of the Enlightenment era, they're going to have a tendency to embellish the history even more based on their Enlightenment point of view.
The one thing that really annoys me, and this is actually based on what I was reading just now, like listening to the stream in the background, people don't know Latin anymore, so they can't actually go and read the primary sources, right? So they'll just take whatever Gibbon or whatever says. Like an example of this, there's a book that I'm looking at called Atheismus Triumphantus, right, which is atheism triumphed upon by a Thomistic, well, not Thomistic, a Dominican preacher called Tommaso Campanella. Now, I can't find an English translation of this, but according to the guy who wrote the 48 Laws of Power, apparently this makes a really strong argument for atheism. But how can now? I'm not calling him a liar, but I think that it's extremely uncommon to have a high enough level of Latin literacy to just be able to pick up this book and read it. And there's no English translation, so I don't know if he's just making it up. But like with what little Latin I can see, I mean, I'm looking over the preface now. I can't necessarily make good heads or tails of it, but I really doubt they were that strong.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend if you're going to learn language, or if you have children, right, just make them learn Latin.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this here right now. Like it goes, examen Mahometis, examen Judaïs, examen Gentifini. Like this doesn't actually have anything to do with atheism. This is referring to other religions. This isn't referring to atheism. I'll post it in the.
Well, I if you want to share screen for any of this, you can.
I mean, like I can't read Latin that well. I doubt that many of the people in the audience can, so I've just shared it in the chat if they want to have a look.
But yeah, I mean, I know a lot of atheists. Their historiography is super cringe. They will they'll project their own views onto the past, and they'll assume that like anything that deviates from small o Orthodox Christianity must be atheist. Like I think I might mention this on the Is Atheism Cringe stream, that like atheists will look at philosophers or like figures from, say, the American Revolution that weren't Christian, and they're like, oh well, I guess these were all atheists.
Yeah.
Also, I'd like to respond to a point in the chat from Harry Gus. More peaceful society, nobility would kill each other. Yeah, there was a higher level of low intensity warfare, like two local families sparring with each other with like 50 guys, right? But now we have these modern cataclysmic wars where cities get nuked.
Yeah, this actually relates to a lot of what I've been spieling about in terms of what Pareto writes. Like all of this concept of the use of force. This is actually speaking in terms of how the elites interact with each other, right? And the way you actually get this totally degenerated elite class is when the elites are not actually engaging with each other in that way, when they're not willing to use force against one another. So it's actually good to have, as you put it, some level of low intensity warfare going on between your elites, right? And when that's not happening, that actually is what permits the degeneration into one type to happen, to where they become totally crippled. And that's a weird thing to think about, right? It's not, you wouldn't normally think of sort of like low scale warfare going on in your ruling class to be a good thing for the stability of your society, but it actually is.
You know, Renaissance, I just can't believe you said that the middle-aged intellectual ruling class was better educated and had better wisdom than our current ruling class. You Archie Bunker troglodyte. That's just... But really though, it's like classical education. We need to revive that, because let me tell you, that is way better than what they're producing now. When you listen to a Schumann symphony, you're listening to better stuff than what are they making now these days? What are the fangled kids making these days? Baby, that Justin Bieber song, what is that?
Yeah, I mean, like you read people like, I don't know, Voltaire, who said that the Bible is full of contradictions, and then you learn about all of these patristic commentators who, explained it. Maybe if people actually read those, maybe they wouldn't say "her Sky Daddy."
I know, right? It's if they had their hands on something rigorous, then this problem would have been completely overcome. But the whole point is that all the rigorous material is censored and purged and gone.
And frankly, Voltaire didn't have any excuse. He went to a Jesuit school, so he would have known that it's not contradictory.
As someone who went to a Catholic school, even back then, this Voltaire.
I mean, like the Ratio Studiorum of the Jesuit schools was actually pretty good. And granted, it kind of did overemphasize the classics, but if they'd actually, like, they had sacred scripture classes, so they would have known pretty well, like, okay, this part means this, right? I don't know if he had access to, say, I don't know, the Glossa Ordinaria, which was a particularly common translation, at least in medieval Europe. I'm not sure if the Jesuits used it. He would have known, okay, so some of these things are types for other things. You know, there's a spiritual meaning to the text, and it's not always the literal meaning.
Right. All right. And here in this section of the speech, he kind of gets to, in a sense, what actual convergence happened between the Eastern and Western world. Although he got it wrong about exactly what happened, but he noticed this one commonality that would allow for convergence to happen. All right, and this is what he says. As humanism in its development became more and more materialistic, it made itself increasingly accessible to speculation and manipulation, at first by socialism and then by communism. So that Karl Marx was able to say in 1844 that communism is naturalized humanism. This statement turned out not to be entirely senseless. One does see the same stones in the foundations of a despiritualized humanism and of any type of socialism. Endless materialism, freedom from religion and religious responsibility, which under communist regimes reach the stage of anti-religious dictatorship. Concentration on social structures with a seemingly scientific approach. This is typical of the Enlightenment in the 18th century and of Marxism. Not by coincidence, all of communism's meaningless pledges and oaths are about man, with a capital M, and his early happiness. At first glance, it seems an ugly parallel. Common traits in the thinking and way of life of today's West and today's East, but such is the logic of materialistic development. The interrelationship is such, too, that the current of materialism, which is most to the left, always ends up being stronger, more attractive, and victorious, because it's more consistent. Humanism, without its Christian heritage, cannot resist such competition. So yeah, I mean, he identifies Cthulhu swimming left right there, and that's the problem. Our Overton window is humanism, and humanism is ironically inhumane.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this paragraph.
I mean, the early Soviets were saying that that socialism, their state socialism was scientific government. It was the true realization of that. But in the West, the liberals would disagree and say that our more neoliberal system was truly scientific government. But of course, neither of them could conquer it, but all of them wanted the brand of scientific government.
Yeah, and of course it's impossible, as Moldbug points out, to actually govern scientifically because it's impossible to conduct scientific experiments on that scale. So it's pseudo-scientific government. Yeah, I guess one of the interesting things here is like evil basically always lies, and all of these evil ideologies want to claim this label of humanism, even though what they're doing is completely anti-human because it rejects the spiritual aspect of humanity and boils humans down not to purely material units, right? So it's really completely anti-human, but they label it humanism, and they compete for that label, even though I would say none of them are humanistic at all if you're talking about what a human being really is, because there is a necessary spiritual dimension to human.
Yeah, it's humanism. They got it wrong. It's just called Satanism. But yeah, I mean,
yeah, it's funny. It's funny, but I did that stream with AA the other day on the occult, and that's actually quite true. Weirdly, the specifics of Luciferianism are actually quite interesting to read about, because it's not just like worshiping evil for the sake of evil per se, right? It has to do with the worship of the material.
Sorry, Sailor, we interrupted.
Yeah, I mean, when they say humanism, I guess like a better term for it might be neo-humanism, because what they're looking for is to create a new man. They're not looking to actually, what they're not really looking for is man as he actually exists. What they're looking for is man as they want him to exist.
Yeah, I find it quite ironic. It is one of those meme moments where it's the bell curve meme. The Church of Satan people are all these new atheists, right? And the small brain would be like Satan bad, and their institution is terrible. And then the midwit new atheists are like, oh no, actually, our ideology is about humanism, and it's about Satan was actually the good guy in the story because he was rebelling against the totalitarianism of God and everything. And then the Hayek was just like, oh, humanism is Satanism. So it's just like it's quite ironic how they even the people that take it up ironically, they fall into the trap itself, and then they're the ones espousing humanism as Satanism.
Yeah, someone in chat mentioned that Satanism is unchecked hedonism. I wouldn't say that is quite true either from what I read. It really has to do with it's not hedonism per se, but elevating like human material knowledge and achievement as your primary aim of target of worship. I guess like the reason serious Satanists actually worship, or Luciferians actually worship Lucifer, is because, of course, he is the bringer of knowledge to human beings, right? And they actually worship him as this being that is going to allow them to transcend like God, actually, basically, right, through human achievement. So it's there's more to that ideology than purely, you know, making your PP feel good or whatever, right?
I mean,
and it's worth understanding what actually motivates these people specifically.
In fairness,
it's about build Babel back better.
You see, the thing is that I'm not sure it's strictly true. I think it is, or at least it begins as I want my PP to feel good, because servant of God, Father John Harden, pointed out that I don't think there's any heretics. I think he said something like all of the heretics, at least the Protestant heretics, had problems with purity. You know, Martin Luther broke his vows and married a nun, right? For example, and allowed bigamy with Philip of Hesse, for example.
So I'll actually agree with you and say both are true. So their real motivation is that hedonistic impulse, and then the formal ideology laid on top of it has to do with this idea of Lucifer, the light bringer of knowledge, on how to achieve that, basically. So I think it's actually both going on.
I'm not saying that it's, but what I'm saying is that the lust leads to the pride, right? Because if you're someone who will indulge in lust, the whole reason that people fall into lust is because God wants to humiliate us, right? There's a certain humiliation that you get when you're involved in sexual actions. Particularly if you're not in private, or it's scandalous in some other way, right? It's there to humiliate us, right? But if you're somebody who's indulging in that and don't care and don't receive the natural humiliating end of that action, then it's just going to reprobate you further and further, and it's going to make you more and more prideful, right? That's how it's so difficult to quit a pornography addiction, particularly if you spiraled into the particularly degenerate parts of it, right? Because it completely warps your perception of reality, which is, frankly, has its root in pride.
That's interesting.
I would say it's probably like the bell curve meme again. It's the small brain. It's the low IQ Satanist says, I'm in it for the PP feels. The midwit Satanist says, I'm in it for hidden knowledge. And then the big brain Satanist says, I'm in it for the PP feels.
Or it could be just that they want to turn themselves into a pickle.
Okay, so
I think we've gotten a bit off there, huh? So
no. Him BTFOing humanism is exactly part of this conversation, so it's completely on topic. But I think we've covered so many things that Solzhenitsyn has pointed out so well. I think there's one thing that I might want to show you guys before maybe you go into super chats or something like that. And it's the immediate reaction of the newspapers and the media directly after it. And I want to see if the audio works. If the audio doesn't work with this, that would suck. But Dr. Peter Kreeft is a conservative professor at, I think, Boston College. and he was actually in the audience there for the speech. And I couldn't find the articles in any archives, but he reads off some of their responses to it. And it's about 3.5 minutes where he does that. Is that fine for you guys to hear?
I mean, I know about like copyright issues. I'm not really sure how that works.
I doubt that's copyrighted.
I mean, it's fair use anyway.
Okay.
Are we transforming Peter Kreeft, Dr. Kreeft?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I want to see it. Let's just check if the audio works even.
He'll probably have to give you permission. Yeah, it's not working.
Audio doesn't work.
Either get permission or just have Sadler pull it up instead. It should work if he's actually the one streaming it.
I'm not really sure how to give him permission for this.
Jamie, pull that up.
I don't know either. But it might be the case that you have to like let him do audio. But yeah, I know you can share your own computer audio.
Yeah, I sent you the link and the timestamp. But if you're able to give audio permission, that'll be amazing.
I bet there was a lot of coping. I bet that's what he's going to basically say.
Oh yeah, it was some serious cope, but it was also lots of double speak and just well, it's interesting to see exactly what they say.
Oh yeah, Peter Kreeft is amazing. His books are great, by the way. For those who don't know of him, his book on Aquinas is really top class.
Yeah, I'm actually not familiar with him.
Yeah, Modern Scholar series, Thomas Aquinas. That's a very, very good book. I listened through it a couple of years ago. Got me really started with Thomism.
So he's basically taking the position against Solzhenitsyn here when you talk about cope, or
oh no, he's reading the newspaper reactions.
Okay,
directly after. Yeah,
that's switched.
Okay, I got no idea. Sorry, if you want to give us highlights from that, feel free. But I don't know how this works.
Let me see what I can do. Basically, he's reading from the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and those newspapers. And I think the Boston Globe is Solzhenitsyn gives all these not only leads through many different ideas, but he actually comes to conclusions, or he's like definitively describing what he thinks is true about the problems. And so they kind of dance around that, where how dare he declare any kind of objective truth about these circumstances. Another one just questions him on the point of how could he say that in the East there was such massive suffering and that caused them to be spiritually stronger than people in the West. They just questioned and dismissed that. That was another thing that they said. It's just general. It was just general naysaying. Other than them holding to their ideological convictions about truth and about material flourishing, it's just a bunch of naysaying and dismissal and ignoring. So we can come to a couple conclusions about this. It might be because they've just become incompetent and deracinated, and that's a clear possibility. But it could also be that they just don't care, and they're willing to do the managed decline over however long it takes for Solzhenitsyn's predictions to come true. And or it could be both, which would be quite unfortunate. But that really shows you why these people will just eventually have to be replaced. They had their chance and they dismissed it.
See, I think it is a little bit of both, but I think the idea of managed decline is a right-wing idea. I don't think the elites actually think in terms of managed decline. As I've been getting at the whole time, they only think in terms of the present, right? They're not even forward-looking enough to think about managed decline. They're just thinking about what can I do right now to increase my GDP growth or whatever. They're not actually thinking at all about the far-reaching future. It would actually be better if they were thinking of managed decline, because at least then there would be a plan for the decline. But the managed decline is a byproduct of their focus on the present, not actually a plan for the future. At least that's how I've come to see it.
So it may actually be just up to incompetence and short-term eyesight, because they wouldn't be making some of the decisions they're making if they actually thought about the long term, especially financially and socially. So
yeah, I mean, I think you even hear some of this if you've listened to some of the speeches that have been bandied about from Joe Biden, right? There was this famous, it's not a leaked one, it was like an hour and a half one, and he said some interesting things about African Americans and Hispanics in there and needing to learn to get along and everything like that. And he's basically pointing out the future demographics of the US, and he's sort of revealing there that he doesn't really have a plan for it either, right? Like the suggested in his words is that the elites don't actually yet have any coherent strategy for actually figuring out how they're going to deal with the ethnic changes in the United States in the future.
Oh man, like kind of related to the humanism we were talking about. Just found some real cringe from Voltaire. If you want to hear it, it's like
Go ahead.
It's like Jehovah's Witness tier cringe as well, right? So he claims that Christianity is propagandistic, yet in his dictionary of philosophy, he says that the early church had 50 gospels and decided to choose 4 just at complete random, and then propagated the myth that the canon of the New Testament was decided at Nicaea. Right? These things did not happen, suffice to say. In fact, like anybody who knows anything knows that this is cringe.
Yeah. People. I can't remember. I think it was Gibbon who. I think it was Gibbon who. What is the origin of the Nicaea myth? Might be someone else, but yeah, it's just like complete pseudo history. There's no evidence for this whatsoever.
I don't understand.
Nicaea had nothing to do with the biblical canon.
I don't understand how. Like, I mean, I think
and this is repeated by atheists constantly to this day, that it was like just randomly decided at Nicaea.
I don't understand like these assertions. Like the thing is that Voltaire could have very easily gotten access to the sources on this, and yet he's essentially pulling something out of somewhere very dark.
Yeah, I mean that just sort of goes to show it. It's like what 21st was saying earlier. I went to a Catholic school. Voltaire did literally go to a Jesuit school, even one that you're saying should have been pretty good. And despite that, it didn't matter. He was completely unable to know like the most basic things about how the biblical canon was formed.
I don't understand. Like this is something that's actually bothering me now. Like this guy is held up as this hyper intellectual type, and yet he's got like some of the most uneducated opinions on a religion that I've ever seen.
Maybe when I become a quadrillionaire, I'm gonna have to buy up a bunch of these Catholic schools and set up some really what is it, Saint Benedict that established a set of rules. I'm gonna set up a set of very harsh rules around what's going to be done. But I don't know, it's a perennial problem, I guess.
Reactionary Mount Athos, but for Catholics, I see.
Yeah, I mean, what someone said in chat there about Voltaire having a political agenda, I think is something that shouldn't be forgotten. I mean, probably 300 years from now, you could look at Moldbug's analysis of ultra Calvinism and be like, wow, this guy was really off the mark here, what an idiot. But there's kind of there's an agenda driving that analysis. And even if he's incredibly wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's stupid. And I would say the same could potentially apply to Voltaire here.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with the thing is with Voltaire, though, is that if he were in a Protestant country, or even like in the 19th or 20th century or now, I'd understand it, right? Because the level of education was just simply not there. But he was born was it the beginning of the 18th century, and he went to a Jesuit school where he was surrounded by all of these like highly educated priests. Like you need 2 PhDs to become a Jesuit. I don't know if it's the same then, but now like he was born at the end of the 17th century. He had no excuse. He had absolutely no excuse for coming to those conclusions.
Well, he was probably just a soy boy.
There's a lot I could say, but I mean I don't know the situation.
What are we looking for now?
super chats, I guess. Got a couple more. Zero Kev. Real atheism has never been tried. This is more or less almost what right-wing atheists tell me. Real atheism has never been tried. Real atheism is based. Shut up.
In a funny way, it's almost true, because the problem with trying to do atheism is that human beings have a permanent religious impulse that, as far as we can tell, is literally impossible to get rid of. So you're never going to actually create your... Obviously, he's memeing here, but you can't actually create some sort of atheist utopia, because people will simply generate a religion automatically if they're deprived of one.
Yeah, I mean, it's like real communism has never been tried. It is kind of true, as in the real communist utopia has never been achieved, but all they're really saying there, or like the truth behind real communism has never been tried, is real communism is impossible, and attempting communism is awful.
It's true in a way that actually completely BTFOs them with their own point.
Yeah. And Kiewich for $10 New Zealand says, just stopping by to you all a happy and prosperous new year. Also to Settlers and Charlemagne, well done on Millennial. Thank you very much, Kiewich. The Millennial interview, if anyone here hasn't already seen it, make sure to go check it out. I did an interview on Millennial Woes' channel yesterday, or I think it was yesterday, the day before, actually, I think. I don't know, it was a bit weird. I was mostly just talking about religion. That wasn't really my goal, but I don't know, I felt like I was just giving like the basics of Catholic apologetics. I mean, that wasn't it. I did talk about, I did also talk about other stuff. I talked about politics too. I annoyed some libertarians quite a bit at the beginning, but yeah, I don't know. I talked more about religion than I was really intending, just kind of how it shook up.
Well, I'm halfway through the stream. I was watching it earlier today. So far it seems solid. Just what you were talking about. Woes seemed genuinely interested in what you were talking about.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm not saying it was bad or anything. It just wasn't really what I was expecting to do.
Yeah, I think Woes actually seems to manage his streams really well, because he tends to nail down a single topic he wants to cover, and then covers that topic in somewhere between 1 and 2 hours, right? So yeah, I had a pretty good experience there, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way that I could do like 3 or 4 live streams every day for half a month.
No, it's actually incredible what he's able to put together. And, like I told him, I think it's a really important tradition that we have now, to do this every year and sort of indirectly meet up and see where we're at and just lay out where we are on the table, right? It's a really important tradition. So I hope it continues on, as far as he's willing to go with it, and then beyond if someone else takes it up eventually. It definitely wouldn't be the same to have Christmas time without millennial this in a year.
Settler, I just have the end of his speech left.
Go ahead.
All right, here it is. If the world has not come to its end, it has approached a major turn in history, equal in importance to the turn from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It will exact from us a spiritual upsurge. We shall have to rise to a new height of vision, to a new level of life, where our physical nature will not be cursed as in the Middle Ages, but even more importantly, our spiritual being will not be trampled upon as in the modern era. This ascension will be similar to climbing onto the next anthropologic stage. No one on Earth has any other way left but upward.
That's a really good ending. I really like what he said there, about how each of these eras came with its own debilitating aspects. Yeah, I mean, so far it seems like we're failing at this pretty hilariously, but there's still a lot of time left to right ourselves. I mean, we're not out for the count yet. That's for sure.
Well, I do know that Harvard academia is down for the count. That's why I'm sure of.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I think the existing institutions that we depended on in the modern era are of very low utility in terms of dealing with what he's pointing out here, because they are literally the things that have trampled on our spiritual nature, right?
They hated him because he told them the truth, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really impressive speech. I'm guessing it was about a 10-minute speech, probably. And he really
it was 1 hour.
It was 1 hour? Wow.
Yes.
Huh. I guess
I'm glad I read it and didn't listen to it. I don't know. I guess it's the accent that makes him take so long talking.
He read it in Ruski, in Russian, and they translated it live.
Oh.
And yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because you can read it in 10 minutes. Well, I think it's pretty impressive, the amount of just the full run of ideas he was able to put in here and keep it coherent. Definitely really good speech by Solzhenitsyn. I'll just link it in chat again. Yeah, it is always it's a bit disconcerting, I guess, to uncover things like this and find people like Solzhenitsyn making a lot of the same criticisms that we make now. And it kind of highlights, I think, the failure of the civilization to actually confront and deal with these problems. Because it's not like they've been unrecognized, right? Like, they've been excessively recognized, but the ruling establishment, of course, is exclusionary to them because, you know, as he pointed out, the entire goal is to transcend spirituality through materialism.
Everything he said has aged so well over 50 years, better than, you know, CGI in Jurassic Park.
Yeah, it's hard to really find anything in here to disagree with, other than that one bit that I pointed out where, you know, his prediction was just wrong about the convergence of the Soviet Union and the United States. But I don't think a single person in the world could have really seen or understood that without the historical perspective that we have now on that.
Could you, for the benefit of the audience, post the Kreeft talk in this chat?
Oh yes, let me find that. Yeah, I'm gonna go back to the link. But I'm sure now in China, Xi Jinping is snickering or laughing, or I don't think he's one to make many facial expressions, but he's definitely thinking in his mind, "Wow, we've got them wrapped around our thumb." But clearly, even from an outside perspective, you can see it's in a stage of decline. But here's the link. I just posted it in chat.
In the YouTube chat?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I'm just behind on it.
Yeah, so, I mean, anything else about Solzhenitsyn you want to talk about, Reaction?
I mean, he's quite the figure. He had quite the life. He was educated at, I forget which school he was educated at, but he was part of the educated class. He studied mathematics at Rostov University, as you can see here. That was sent to the Gulag. And if any of you listeners haven't read or listened to the Gulag Archipelago, it's worth listening to understand the depth of human suffering that's possible for a person. And for our Western people, it feels like we're just missing something in our lives in that way, where there's just this new layer of understanding that you get from immense suffering about just life in general that I think is so important. So it's so important to listen to someone like Solzhenitsyn, who never was at a loss for words, to say the least. All of his works are very long. So yeah, he had an impressive career, and it's amazing how much you can be right on. I don't even think it was all about himself. It was just about there was so much to observe over the 20th century that could be recorded.
Apparently, Solzhenitsyn advised the abridged version himself, which is interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, sounds like it'd be good as an audiobook, I think. Like I have the whole 3-volume set, right? It's so much to read at once, and I've kind of, I guess I've lost interest to some extent, just because I've lost interest in Peterson, and like that's where a lot of people got interested in Solzhenitsyn from. But yeah, maybe I'll check out the abridged audiobook.
You will have to listen to like an hour-long foreword by Jordan Peterson if you get the one on Audible.
Really? Yes, I would definitely skip that.
I mean, it's just like it's basically just Jordan Peterson being Jordan Peterson, and then the book is like entirely different from how he describes it.
Yeah, I mean, I get Jordan Peterson recommendations sometimes. Still, I hope people realize the degree to which he is containment, and that Peterson is not someone you should really be spending time on.
He's actually returned to the fold after his exile in Russia.
Yeah, surprising. I mean, I'm glad he got out of his Soviet prison camp or whatever he was doing to himself.
He was in a Russian hospital because he had a very severe reaction to his anxiety medications, his psychotropic drugs that are supposed to solve the spiritual anguish within. But you know, it is quite tragic. I do feel bad for him because he's seems like a very sensitive guy, but the struggle he had in that year kind of was demonstrable of what was wrong with his belief system in very interesting ways. But yeah,
I didn't say 4 hours of Peterson Calhoun. I said 1 hour. Just didn't want to.
Yeah, that's pretty long for an intro. I mean, wow, 1 hour.
Yeah, I mean,
4 hours in the
the
chat.
point is it's trying to make the book shorter.
Yeah, must be a really long introduction.
Everything's abridged except the foreword. Yeah, this is why you don't take Jung for your starting point and you take someone like Augustine instead.
Yeah, on that note, I'm actually looking at, I want to read Pareto properly, but his work has thousands and thousands of pages, which is kind of not really tenable. But there's a compendium of general sociology that I think AA recommended to me. That's only like 500 pages, and it's like authorized by him, right? So I think that might be a good Pareto read to satisfy my itch there. Just if anyone's interested in looking into Pareto.
Yeah, you could do the same with Augustine, right? Like I think it's something ridiculous, like 90% of his writings aren't even translated into English. So thankfully you're avoiding most of it. But even amongst the English stuff, there are tens of thousands of pages.
Yeah, this is one of my pet peeves or whatever, I guess. But I always, every once in a while, I'll hear some evangelicals say something like, "Oh, it's such a shame there's no writings from the early Christians." It's like, dude, there's more stuff that you could possibly ever read in your entire life.
250 patristic volumes we have from this. There was a priest called Father Migne, Migne, and he collected volumes that were known as the Patrologiae, the Latina, which are the Latin ones, the Graece ones, which are the Greek ones, and the Orientalis ones, which are in Aramaic, Syriac, and I suspect Coptic as well. We have like 250, 300 volumes of Church Fathers, and a lot's not even translated.
Yeah, it's frustrating. Speaking sort of on that topic, recently, or for Christmas, I had a sort of a special on my channel. I read out a sermon from St. Augustine, which I kind of liked that. I thought it was a nice thing to do. And some of the comments seemed to enjoy it quite a bit. And I got comments outside of YouTube too, saying people that had enjoyed it. But with that said, it kind of disappointing how horrible the views on it were. It's like the worst viewed video that I've had in a very long time. It doesn't even have 1,000 views yet. So I don't know. I'd like to do stuff like that, but I can't really do it if it's going to get such horrible views. So I guess what I'm saying is watch my stuff, guys. This is not optional.
I just wanted to say the best thing about Solzhenitsyn writing about modernity is that he was not intellectually poisoned in the mind by the Anglosphere English political tradition and all of its consequences and humanism and all that stuff. So yeah, that's why he was able to cut through the BS in these kinds of speeches and just get right to the point of it, instead of this flowery window dressing about limited government and individual rights and all that nonsense.
The social contract.
No, the social contract, man. But yeah, I won't get into that.
It's funny because it's funny because like that's central to liberalism is the social contract, and then you get libertarians who they've progressed past the purpose for the social contract. Because even like I remember back when I was a libertarian, ANCAPs would make fun of it, like, oh, when did I sign the social contract? But their entire ideology would not have gotten to where it is today without that as its basis.
Exactly. It's like it is like modern atheism too, where they, for some reason, they stake themselves down in the ground in the empiricist tradition that grew out of the 17th and 18th centuries. I wonder where that came from. But it's just so it's also tiresome.
Looks like Aaron McIntyre just went live. So might be a good time to wrap up.
Yeah. I guess just a couple more loose ends, or at least one more thing, is I wouldn't mind doing more streams like this, sort of reviews of some sort of document or speech or whatever. So if anyone has any suggestions, feel free to like mention it in the comment section below, or message me or whatever, mention on Discord. Join my Discord server. That I'm pretty active there. Follow me on Twitter. Give me money. Giving me money is not optional. YouTube takes a 30% cut, so it's always preferable if you can donate on Subscribestar. I'm always happy to answer questions on air from Subscribestar donors. Anyone else have anything else they need to say? Make sure to subscribe to everyone here. That is also mandatory.
I just got my super male vitality in the mail, so we'll see how that works for increasing my gains. I'll be sure to let you guys know.
Charlemagne, I had a feeling that you were you seem to already have taken 10 doses of that with how you've been with what you've been doing recently. But
I mean that's
more than
to at least double your Chad levels.
No, I haven't even opened it yet.
Yeah, but all I can say is God bless Solzhenitsyn, and thank you for this topic. I think he covered so much that's worth noticing.
Yeah. I'm glad you found that. It's really interesting to find little gems like this.
Yeah. Well, everyone, thank you everyone for watching. Subscribe, donate, all that type of stuff. Goodbye.